Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. I'm not someone who scares easily. I loved horror movies. The creepier, the better. I used to watch them in the middle of the night with the house dark and silent. No matter how tense the scenes got, I could always tell myself it was only a movie, pure fiction. Real life wasn't like that, or at least that's what I believed. That night began like any other. It was late September, and the weather had suddenly changed. The air was cool, almost cold, and one of those storms that appear out of nowhere when summer gives way to fall was moving in. I was home alone, enjoying the quiet after a long day. I had the place to myself. My roommate Sam had gone out of town for the weekend, and I planned to make the most of it. The rain had just started. First a soft tapping against the windows that gradually grew louder and more insistent. I was in the living room curled up on the couch with my laptop, halfway through a new game I'd been obsessed with for days. It was one of those narrative games that pulls you in with its world and its characters. I was lost in it, completely absorbed. The outside world faded away as I wandered through the game's bleak, haunted landscapes. The first flash of lightning pulled me away from the screen. A burst of light filled the room for an instant and then plunged it back into shadow. I looked up and for the first time noticed how dark it had gotten outside. The storm had arrived all at once. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Thunder rolled overhead, a deep growl that seemed to make the walls tremble. I paused the game with a sudden urge to stretch my legs. The room felt too quiet now, with the sounds of the storm slipping into the edges of my awareness. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the street. The rain was pouring down. The streetlight cast distorted reflections across the soaked pavement. The houses across from mine were dark, their windows unlit, empty. Everyone was sheltering from the storm. I was about to step away when I saw him. He was standing on the sidewalk directly across from my house. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but another flash of lightning lit up the sky and I saw him clearly. A man in a gray hoodie, motionless, as if he were staring straight at me. My first thought was that he must be waiting for someone, maybe a neighbor. But the way he stood there, so disturbingly calm in the middle of the storm, set off every alarm in me. I watched him a moment longer, waiting for him to move, to give some sign of being a normal person caught in the rain. He didn't. He just stood there, staring. An icy chill ran down my spine and I hurried to close the curtain. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just some guy who got caught in the storm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to his presence than simple bad luck. I tried to go back to my game, but my focus was gone. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see him there, watching me from outside. After a few minutes, I gave up and turned the game off. The house felt too big, too empty. The silence pressed in on me from all sides. I went to the kitchen. I thought making some tea might calm me down. The rain was still coming down hard, its drumming against the roof filling the whole house. I was reaching for the kettle when the doorbell rang. The sound sliced through the silence like a knife and made me jump. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in weather like that. Who could it be? The doorbell rang again, more insistently. I walked slowly to the front door, my mind racing. It could be a delivery person, I thought, or maybe a neighbor who needed something. But when I got close and looked through the peephole, my breath caught in my throat. It was him. The man in the hoodie was standing on my porch. His face was hidden by the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me. I could sense the intensity of his stare even through the door. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What the hell was he doing there? How had he gotten from the street to my porch so quickly, so silently? My mind spun with questions that had no reassuring answers. He didn't move. He just stood there, waiting. I didn't open the door. Something deep inside me told me that would be a terrible idea. Instead, I backed away, trying not to make a sound, my heart racing out of control. I slipped back into the living room, leaving the lights off, hoping he wouldn't see me through the windows. I could hear my own breathing, broken and uneven, almost as loud as the rain. What felt like an eternity passed with me simply standing there, listening, waiting. But the doorbell didn't ring again. Little by little, I started to relax, convincing myself that maybe he had left. Maybe it was some bizarre prank or a case of mistaken identity. And then I heard it. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving along the side of the house. My blood ran cold. He was still there, looking for a way in. I moved as quietly as I could, forcing myself to stay calm, trying to think. The doors were locked, but there were windows all over the house, and the thought of him finding a way inside, slipping through the shadows while I stayed trapped in here helpless, was almost unbearable. I grabbed my phone and called Sam. He didn't answer. Of course not. He was probably out with friends and had it on silent. I muttered a curse under my breath, running through my options. I could call the police, but what would I say? That there was a guy standing outside? They wouldn't take it seriously unless he actually tried to break in. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything went strangely quiet. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. Nothing. Only the rain pounding relentlessly against the windows. Suddenly, a sharp bang echoed through the house, nearly making my soul jump out of my body. A single crash that bounced through every room. It came from the back door, the one that opens onto the small patio in the yard. I ran toward it with my heart hammering in my ears. I reached the kitchen just in time to see it. A brief flash through the glass, the dark silhouette of the hooded man pressed against the door. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see his hands, pale and ghostly, pressed against the glass, testing the knob. Panic surged through me in a wave, and without thinking, I grabbed the first thing within reach. A kitchen knife, cold and sharp in my trembling hand. I held it out in front of me, as if it could protect me from whatever was lurking outside. The door shook as he tried to force it, but thankfully it was locked. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as he kept pressing against the glass. His breath fogged up the window. He was close enough now that I could see his eyes, cold, dark, and completely devoid of emotion. For a moment I stood frozen, caught between the instinct to run and the need to stand my ground. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped back and melted into the shadows. I struggled to breathe as I waited, convinced he would try another door, another window. But he didn't. He was gone. I don't know how long I stayed there, clutching the knife, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the house was silent, every creak amplified by the tension hanging in the air. At last, I gathered the courage to go to the front entrance. I hesitated for a moment and opened the door carefully, peering out into the storm. The porch was empty. The street beyond was dark and deserted. But as I closed the door, I saw it. A small piece of paper stuck to the glass at eye level. With trembling hands, I peeled it off, a pit of dread opening in my stomach. The note was simple, written in neat, precise handwriting. "Have you forgotten?" The words on that paper haunted me for days. I couldn't stop thinking about them, replaying that night over and over in my head. The man in the hood, the way he moved so silently, so deliberately. And that question, "Have you forgotten?" I tried to go on with my life as if nothing had happened, but the truth was I was shaken. I had never experienced anything like that before, and the fear had settled into my bones, gnawing at me every time I was alone. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, jumping at every little noise, every creak in the floor. Sam noticed right away when he came back. "Dude, are you okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, dropping his backpack by the door, looking concerned. I forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. "Yeah, I just slept badly. The storm was intense." He nodded, accepting the excuse without questioning it. But as the days passed, he started noticing how uneasy I was. I caught him watching me, frowning, though he didn't press the issue. That was something I had always appreciated about Sam. He knew when to give someone space. One night I got a call. It was late, almost midnight. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. I picked it up, expecting it to be Sam. He had started going out again, but it wasn't him. The screen showed a blocked caller ID, a string of meaningless numbers. For a second I thought about not answering, but something pushed me to swipe accept. "Hello?" Silence. I could only hear my own breathing, the persistent pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I repeated, my voice barely steady. Then I heard it, a rough whisper, almost swallowed by static. "Have you forgotten?" The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. I didn't recognize the voice, but the words were the same. The same chilling question that had been left on the note. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, pale, expressionless, watching me from the shadows. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, some sick prank. But I knew it. He wasn't done with me. And then I heard it. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving through the house. My blood turned to ice. I knew those footsteps. I had heard them before. I sat upright with my heart racing, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. Run where? There was nowhere to hide, nowhere he couldn't reach me. I grabbed the kitchen knife again, my hands shaking as I held it out in front of me. The footsteps sounded closer now, louder, until they stopped just on the other side of the living room door. I held my breath. Every muscle in my body was tight with pure fear. The silence was deafening, the weight almost unbearable. The door opened with a slow creak, and there he was. The man in the hoodie stood in the doorway. I couldn't see his full face, but I could make out his eyes, cold, dark, and filled with something that sent ice through my spine. He didn't speak. He just stood there watching me, filling the room with a feeling of suffocation and threat. I tightened my grip on the knife. My mind was racing. I had to do something. I had to protect myself. But before I could move, he took a step toward me, and I stayed rooted to the spot. "Why are you doing this to me?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. He tilted his head as if weighing the question, and took another step forward. "Have you forgotten?" he finally murmured, his voice low and raspy, like dry leaves dragged across the ground by the wind. The words pierced me with terror. I stumbled backward until I hit the wall. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my throat closed up. The words got stuck in my chest. He took another step. Now I could see his face, pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. There was something familiar about him, something tugging at the edges of my memory, but I couldn't place it. "Please leave me alone," I begged, barely audible. He didn't stop. He kept coming, his footsteps soft and measured, until he was standing right in front of me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen. But instead of the cold touch of his hand, I heard the door slam shut. When I opened my eyes, he was gone. The room was empty. The door was closed as if he had never been there at all. I collapsed onto the floor. The knife slipped from my fingers as I gasped, trying to fill my lungs. My whole body was shaking. My mind was a whirlwind, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It couldn't. There was no explanation that fit. All I knew was that the man in the hoodie had vanished, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was alone. or so I thought. As I tried to calm my racing heart, I saw something on the floor, a few steps away from where I was sitting. Another note. The same neat, precise handwriting as before. This one said something different. You will remember. I never saw him again, but that last note could not have been more accurate. Years have passed since that night, and I remember it as if it happened yesterday. Story 2. I have always found storms strangely comforting to listen to. They have a rhythm of their own, the rain falling in sheets, the deep rumble of thunder in the distance, the way the world seems to stop for a moment, wrapped in the fury of nature. My son Arthur, who is 6 years old, inherited that fascination. It almost became a tradition for us to sit together under the gazebo in the backyard and watch the storms roll in. That August night began like so many others. They had been forecasting the storm all week, a late summer downpour that would break the heat wave that had kept everyone sweating for days. As soon as the first drops began tapping against the windows, Arthur tugged at my sleeve, his eyes wide with excitement. "Dad, can we go outside, please?" I smiled at his enthusiasm. It was impossible to say no. "Of course, champ. Let's grab some snacks and head to the gazebo." When we stepped outside, the world was already beginning to change. Dark clouds seemed to swallow the last traces of light, turning the sky into a churning, restless sea of gray. The air was thick and heavy, with that stillness that only comes before a major storm. We walked to the gazebo, a wooden structure at the back of the yard, tucked beside the tree line. It was our little refuge, a place where we could watch the chaos while staying safe and dry. We settled in. Arthur nibbled on a bag of chips while I leaned back on the bench, listening to the soft whisper of leaves stirred by the wind. The first streaks of lightning split the sky, lighting up the trees at the edge of the yard in a dazzling white flash. Arthur couldn't look away, the glow of the storm reflected in his wide eyes. "Wow, did you see that one, Dad?" he asked, amazed. "I sure did," I replied with a smile. "This one's going to be a big one tonight." The storm began to grow stronger. The rain built into a constant roar on the roof of the gazebo. Thunder cracked through the air directly above us. We both jumped a little, and then Arthur let out a nervous little laugh of excitement. There was something primitive about being out there, in the middle of the storm and yet still safe from its reach. But as it worsened, something began to unsettle me. It was subtle at first, a feeling at the edges of my awareness, like cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows left behind by the lightning became longer, heavier. I tried to shake off the unease, blaming it on my imagination. Then Arthur spoke. "Dad, look over there," he said, pointing toward the tree line at the back of the yard. I followed his finger, squinting through the curtains of rain. For a moment I saw nothing but the black outlines of trunks swaying in the wind. But with the next flash of lightning I saw it, a figure standing right at the edge of the woods, almost blending into the darkness. It was a person, or at least it seemed to be. It was too far away to make out any features, but the posture, so still, so silent, sent a sudden chill down my spine. "It's probably someone from the neighborhood," I told myself, though the words sounded hollow even in my own mind. Who would be out there, in the middle of a storm, standing in our yard? Arthur looked at me, waiting for reassurance. I forced a smile and patted him on the shoulder. "It's okay, champ. It's probably just someone passing through. Stay here. I'm going to take a look." I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf by the door and stepped out into the rain, which soaked me within seconds. I crossed the yard with the beam cutting through the sheets of water. The figure was still there, motionless at the edge of the trees. "Hey," I shouted, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Are you okay?" There was no answer. The silhouette didn't move. It gave no sign that it had even heard me. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I was closer now, close enough to see that it was wearing something dark, maybe a sweatshirt with the hood pulled over its head. "If you're lost, I can help you," I called again. Nothing, not even a gesture. I took a few more steps, and then the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, so quickly and silently that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. The woods swallowed it, the darkness closing behind it. I stood there staring for a while, my heart in my throat. I wanted to follow, to make sure someone had really been there, but the sensible part of me knew that was a bad idea. I was already soaked to the bone, and heading into the dark woods in the middle of a storm did not sound smart. I turned back toward the house, forcing myself to walk calmly so Arthur wouldn't see how shaken I was. When I returned to the gazebo, I found him exactly where I had left him, his face pale. "Did you see him, Dad?" he asked in a small voice. "I saw someone, but he's gone now," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It was probably just someone from the neighborhood. He probably got lost in the rain." Arthur nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Neither was I, if I'm being honest. Even so, I didn't want to scare him. "We should go back inside, okay? It's getting worse." He didn't argue. We gathered our things and crossed the yard while the wind howled around us. Once inside, I locked the door with a strange sense of relief at being back in the warm, brightly lit house. Outside, the storm kept rattling the window frames. At least I thought we were safe, or so I believed. That night, the storm reached its peak. The rain came down in torrents. The wind, like a living thing, shook the house from its foundation. The power flickered a couple of times. We were thrown into darkness, and then suddenly the lights buzzed back on. Arthur had gone to bed, but I knew he was still uneasy about what we had seen. After checking on him, I went to my room. I tried to shake off that lingering unease, telling myself it was just the storm. But lying in bed, listening to the wind and the rain, sleep would not come. In the middle of the night, I heard Arthur's voice calling me. "Dad, Dad, come here." I jumped out of bed, my heart in my throat, and ran down the hallway. He was sitting up, his eyes wide with fear. "What is it, Arthur? What's wrong?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "He's outside, Dad," he whispered, pointing at the window. "The man from the woods." My blood went cold. I slowly turned my head toward the glass. At first, I saw only the rain hitting the window, and beyond it, the trees thrashing in the wind. Then a flash of lightning lit everything up, and I saw him, a figure standing just on the other side of the window, so close I could almost make out his features. He was taller than I had thought, broad-shouldered, hunched under the weight of the storm. The hood was still up, keeping his face hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes. Cold, dark, fixed on me. A surge of fear and protective instinct hit me at the same time. He was not just some stranger lost in the storm. Whoever he was, he had come back, and now he was standing at my son's window. "Stay here," I told Arthur, my voice slightly shaky even though I tried to keep it firm. "I'm going to handle this." I didn't wait for an answer. I grabbed the baseball bat from the closet and headed for the back door, my heart pounding against my chest. The house felt different now, the walls closing in around me. I threw the door open and stepped out into the storm again, gripping the bat tightly. The rain was falling harder now. Every drop felt like a tiny hammer on my skin. I moved quickly, scanning the yard. For a moment, I thought he had vanished. Then I saw him near the corner of the house, half hidden in the shadows. He was watching me. "Hey," I shouted, raising the bat. "Get out of here, leave us alone." The figure didn't move. He just stared at me with those dark eyes unblinking. My pulse thundered, a mix of anger and terror twisting in my stomach. I took a firm step forward, ready to drive him off if I had to. But before I could move again, he was gone. One second he was there, the next he had vanished. I blinked, stunned, trying to make my mind catch up with what I had just seen. I stood there in the rain, soaked and trembling, staring at the empty space where he had been. Part of me wanted to run after him, to make sure he was really gone, but the rational part of me knew I couldn't handle this alone. I backed away slowly, my eyes sweeping over every corner. When I reached the door, I turned and went back inside, locking it behind me. I leaned against the wood, panting. The bat slipped from my hands. I went back to Arthur. He was still in bed, clutching the blanket, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, champ," I said, trying to sound calm. "He's gone now. We're safe." I hugged him, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that it wasn't over. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Somewhere in the darkness, I knew he was still there, watching. The storm began to die down in the early hours of the morning, leaving behind a world soaked and battered by the night's fury. I didn't sleep after that second encounter. I stayed beside Arthur, alert for any sign that he might return. The house remained strangely quiet, except for the constant dripping from the eaves. At dawn, I went outside again, this time with the determination stronger than fear. I needed to know whether there was any trace of the man who had stalked our yard during the storm. The garden was a mess, the grass slick with mud, debris and twigs scattered everywhere. I walked the perimeter, checked the tree line, and looked at the corner where I had last seen him. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. It was as if the storm had washed away all evidence. But I knew what I had seen, what Arthur had seen. They were not tricks of the imagination. I called the police and told them what had happened. They came in the middle of the morning, took my statement, and walked the property with me. Like me, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry on doors or windows. No clues as to who the figure might have been or what he wanted. "It's possible he was just looking for shelter from the storm," one of the officers said, though his voice didn't sound very convinced. "Maybe," I replied, not believing it. There was something about the way he had appeared, the way he had looked at us, that didn't fit with the idea of a lost traveler. After they left, I spent the rest of the day on edge, my nerves shredded by lack of sleep and the lingering fear that he might come back. Arthur was quiet too, staying close to me while we went through our day. I tried to act normal, but the unease hung over us like a shadow. That night, after Arthur fell asleep, I went out to the yard one last time. The air was cool and still. The storm's fury had given way to a calm that felt almost unsettling. Once again, I walked the yard with a flashlight in hand, checking every corner and every shadow. Again, nothing. I stopped at the edge of the yard and looked toward the woods. The trees were dark and silent. Their branches barely moved in the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still there watching. As I turned to go back, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around and aimed the flashlight, but I saw nothing, only darkness stretching endlessly ahead. I stayed outside for a long time, staring into the woods, trying to convince myself it was over, that we were safe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The storm had passed, yes, but the fear it brought with it had left its mark. A lingering sense of danger that would not fade easily. I went back inside and locked the door. Lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the man standing in the rain, watching us. Whoever he was, wherever he had come from, I was certain he was still out there, and I had the feeling he was not finished with us yet. Story 3. Moving to a new place always brings a mix of excitement and nerves. There is the thrill of starting over, of making a space your own, and there is also the stress of unpacking, settling in, and adapting to unfamiliar surroundings. For me, that move was supposed to be a fresh start. I was ready to leave the city behind, to trade noise and chaos for peace and quiet. The house had a certain charm in its own way. Tall windows and a wide yard. It had been empty for some time, The previous owners had left suddenly. That did not worry me. The rent was cheap and the neighborhood was quiet, exactly what I needed. The first few days were a whirlwind of boxes and arranging things. I spent most of my time placing furniture, hanging pictures, and trying to make the place feel like home. The house was cold and drafty, the kind of cold that settles into your bones. I assumed that once I turned on the heat, it would warm up. The only part I did not like was the basement. It was the typical basement of an old house, dark, damp, and smelling of mold, with low ceilings and cracked concrete walls. The staircase leading down was steep and narrow, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering ominously every time you turned it on. I had only gone down there once just to take a look, and I had no intention of going back unless it was absolutely necessary. It gave me a bad feeling. I tried not to think too much about it. After all, basements are supposed to be creepy, right? That night, while I was sitting in the living room surrounded by half-open boxes, the first storm broke. It was one of those summer storms that appear without warning. The sky darkens in an instant, the wind picks up, and suddenly the rain comes pouring down. I watched through the window as lightning tore across the sky. I had always liked storms, their force, their raw energy. It was nature's way of reminding us how small we are. But something about this one was different. Maybe it was the new house, the unfamiliar setting, or simply my nerves. As it grew stronger, a feeling of unease began to sink into me. It started with a sound, a low rhythmic banging that seemed to echo through the house. At first I thought it must be the wind, or something outside being battered by the storm. I listened carefully and realized it was coming from inside. I stood up, my heart beginning to race, trying to locate the source. It was coming from below, from the basement. I hesitated with a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I did not want to go down there, did not want to face whatever was making that sound, but I could not ignore it. The rational part of me said it was probably a loose pipe, or maybe the old boiler. I had to check. I took a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked to the basement door. It opened with a creak, revealing the steep staircase descending into darkness. The banging sounded louder, rising up from below like the methodical pulse of a drum. I took a deep breath to steady myself and started down, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air grew colder with every step. The smell of dampness wrapped around me like a shroud. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if something were waiting for me. When I reached the bottom, I swept the light around, searching for the source. The basement looked just as I remembered. Dark, damp, filled with junk forgotten by previous tenants. The walls were stained with age. The concrete floor was uneven and cracked. And there, at the far end of the room, I saw a door I had not noticed before. Small, barely more than a crawl-space entrance, shut with a heavy rusted padlock. The banging was coming from behind that door, in a steady, relentless rhythm that chilled me to the bone. I stood frozen, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. But there was a part of me that could not bear not knowing what was causing it, and that was the part that pushed me forward. I took a step toward the door. I could hear my own breathing clearly. The banging continued, slow and deliberate, like a heart pounding against the walls. I stretched out my hand, it was shaking, and touched the cold metal of the padlock. It was old, corroded but solid, the kind that had not been opened in years. And suddenly the banging stopped. I froze. The silence fell over me like a weight. All I could hear was the rain hammering outside and the wind howling through the trees. My heart was pounding, and my breathing was short and uneven. I could not stay down there any longer. I ran back up the stairs and did not stop until I had slammed the basement door shut. I stood there leaning against it, trying to catch my breath, telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing there. But deep down, I knew that was not true. The next morning, I could not stop thinking about the basement. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bright, clear day, but the unease remained. I tried to go about my business, unpacking, organizing, though the image of the locked door and whatever had made that sound kept circling in my mind. I had to go down there. I had to know what was behind it. I waited until the afternoon when the sun was high and the house was filled with warm, comforting light. It was easier to face the basement during the day, easier to convince myself there was nothing to fear. I took the flashlight again and also a crowbar I had found in the garage. I went downstairs. The steps creaked under my weight. The air once again grew colder with every step. I forced myself to keep going. Down there, everything was just as dark and moldy as before, but the banging was gone. That was almost worse. A thick, oppressive silence. I made my way toward the locked door, my heart pounding in my chest. The padlock was still there, old and rusted, and I was determined to open it. I wedged the crowbar into it and started prying. The metal groaned. It took longer than I expected. The lock resisted stubbornly. Finally, with a sharp snap, it gave way. The door opened with a creak, revealing a narrow, dark passage leading farther into the basement. I hesitated and pointed the flashlight inside. The air in there was colder, the smell of damp stronger. The corridor was barely wide enough for me to fit through. The walls seemed to close in around me as I stepped inside. I moved slowly, the light trembling in my hand. The hallway seemed endless. I could feel my heart in my throat, the fear building with every step. Then at the far end, a small, dimly lit room came into view. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood. In the center, there was a chair, and sitting in it was a slumped, motionless figure. I stopped it dead. My breath caught in my throat. It was small, almost childlike. Its head hung forward, its hands limp in its lap. The clothes were old, tattered, and covered in dust, as if it had been sitting there for years. I moved closer, panic clawing at my chest. Now I could see it clearly. A little girl, 8 or 9 years old at most. Her hair was tangled, her skin pale and lifeless. I wanted to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that room, but my body would not obey me. I stood rooted to the spot, staring at her face, at the hollow, empty eyes staring back at me. And then, to my horror, she moved. She raised her head, held my gaze, and a slow, unnatural smile spread across her face. She opened her lips and in a voice barely above a whisper spoke. "Why did you leave me?" I stumbled backward. The flashlight slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. Darkness swallowed us. I felt the cold, sticky air closing in around me, while her voice echoed in my ears. I ran blindly, feeling my way back through the hallway, my heart hammering. I could hear her behind me, the soft sound of her footsteps, her whisper growing clearer, closer. "Why did you leave me?" I burst out of the corridor, staggered up the stairs, and slammed the basement door shut behind me. I did not stop until I was outside in the yard, where the blinding sunlight made me squint. I leaned against the wall, gasping, my mind in chaos. What had I just seen? Was it real or some twisted hallucination fed by fear and darkness? Deep down I knew. It was real. The girl in the basement was real, and she was still down there. The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. I could not stop thinking about her, or hearing her voice repeating in my head. That ghostly question, "Why did you leave me?" I could no longer stay in the house. The fear was too much. The sense of threat unbearable. I started sleeping in my car in the driveway, unable to bring myself to walk back through the front door. But even then, I could not escape it. The fear followed me, gnawing at my mind, pushing me to the edge of madness. I knew I had to leave, to get as far away as possible. But there was something that kept pulling me back, as if the house had a hold on me, as if the girl were calling to me, begging me to stay. One night, while I was sitting in the car trying to gather the strength to start the engine, I heard it again. The banging, faint, unmistakable, rising from the basement. I could not ignore it anymore. I had to know what was happening, had to face whatever was down there once and for all. I took the flashlight and went back into the house, my heart lurching. The basement door creaked as it opened, and I descended into the darkness. The air was colder than ever, the smell of mold almost suffocating. The banging echoed louder in the distance like a drum. I made my way to the passage, the light flickering in my hand. The door was still open. The darkness inside seemed to be calling to me. I crossed the threshold, holding my breath, and reached the room at the end. The girl was still there, sitting in the chair. The strange smile was gone. Now her expression was one of sadness, of longing. Her voice came out soft, almost pleading. "Why did you leave me?" I could not move or speak. Fear had me completely paralyzed. I watched her slowly rise to her feet. "Why did you leave me?" she repeated, louder, more urgent. Why did you leave me?" I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the floor, unable to look away from her empty eyes. She took one step toward me, then another. When I finally managed to break the spell, I turned and ran, her voice echoing through the corridor, the darkness closing in around me. I did not stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, the terror still gnawing at me from the inside. I could not stay any longer. I had to leave, to get away from that house no matter what. I grabbed what little I could and left, with the girl's voice still pounding in my head. I never went back. I could not. I sold the house and moved on with my life, trying to bury the past. But no matter how much distance I put between myself and that place, I never escaped the memory of the girl in the basement, or the fear she left carved into me. And sometimes late at night, when the world goes quiet and the darkness clings to the walls, I still hear her voice calling to me. "Why did you leave me?" Story 4. I have always enjoyed driving at night. There is a particular peace in it. The world grows quiet. The road is empty except for the occasional car. It is as if the darkness brings a calm that daylight can never quite achieve. That is why, when the storm began that afternoon, I did not think too much of it. I had driven in worse conditions before. I was coming back from my parents' house, a trip I made at least once a month. The route was familiar to me. Country roads winding through miles of open fields and dense woods. Even during the day, they feel remote. At night, and especially with a storm rolling in, they can feel utterly desolate. The first drops tapped against the windshield as soon as I turned onto the main road, beneath a purple-gray sky. I switched on the wipers and listened to their rhythmic sweep clearing the water away. The storm gathered strength quickly. The rain intensified, the wind shook the car, and the thunder, distant at first, grew deeper and closer. I kept going with my high beams cutting through the darkness. The pavement was barely visible in the downpour. I knew those curves and potholes well, but a storm has a way of making even the most familiar places feel strange, almost threatening. Halfway home, I saw him. The rain was falling in such dense sheets that it felt like driving through a waterfall. I was focused on the road, trying to keep the car from skidding, when a bolt of lightning lit up the sky. In that blinding flash, I saw him clearly, a man standing in the middle of the road dressed entirely in white. My heart shot into my throat and I slammed on the brakes. The tires screamed as they fought for grip. The car skidded, and for one horrifying second I thought I was going to lose control. Miraculously, the tires caught the pavement, and the car came to a sudden stop, just inches from where the man had been standing. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, breathing in short gasps. The rain hammered against the roof with a deafening force, but all I could think about was the man I had almost run over. I could not see him anymore. The darkness and the rain had swallowed him. Who the hell would be out there in the middle of a storm, dressed in white and standing in the road? The question echoed in my mind without an answer while the rain kept pounding without mercy. I slowly loosened my grip on the steering wheel and squinted through the glass. The road was empty. There was no sign of the man in white. I should have felt relieved, but instead a coldness settled inside me, the kind that stays in your bones. Maybe he had stepped off the road, I thought. Maybe he was some poor guy caught in the storm looking for shelter. But if that was the case, why had I not seen him move? It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I shook my head, trying to get rid of the unease. I could not stay there all night. I had to get home. With one last glance at the empty road, I put the car back in gear and moved forward slowly, my hands still trembling on the wheel. Even so, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. The rain sounded louder, the wind more stubborn, as if it were trying to tell me something. I kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting to find the man in white standing behind me. Nothing. The road remained empty, exactly as it should have been. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, and it was about to get worse. I was almost there, only a few miles left, when it happened. The storm was at its worst. The wind howled like an animal, and the rain fell so thick it was like driving through curtains of water. I had to slow to a crawl, straining to make out the line of the road. Then I saw him again. First a glimpse, a pale shape crossing the road, barely visible through the rain. My breath caught. I slammed on the brakes again, my mind racing. I had seen him, hadn't I? The man in white running from one side to the other. Leaning toward the windshield, my breath fogged up the glass. For a moment, everything was still, with only the relentless drumming of the rain filling the silence. Then out of the corner of my eye, a white flash in the ditch. Panic shot through me. I jerked the wheel sharply to avoid him. The tires slid on the wet pavement and the car spun out. I felt the world tilt, the headlights sweeping across the trees in a dizzying arc. And then, with a hard crunch, the car slammed into something solid. The impact knocked the air out of me. The seatbelt drove into my chest. There was a brief darkness in which only my ragged breathing and the rain pounding on the roof existed. When I opened my eyes, I was slumped over the steering wheel, my head throbbing and my vision blurred. The car had stopped halfway between the road and the ditch, the front end crumpled against a tree. I sat there for a moment, trying to piece together what had happened. The man in white. I had seen him, hadn't I? In the cold aftermath of the crash, I was no longer so sure. Had he been real, or had the storm and the darkness played tricks on me? I reached up to touch my forehead. When my fingers brushed a tender spot, I winced. I was bleeding a little, a small cut, but enough to feed the panic rising in my stomach. I had to get out of the car to check whether the man was still there. Fumbling with the seatbelt, I finally managed to unfasten it. I opened the door with a metallic groan and the downpour soaked me instantly. I stood up on shaky legs and looked around. The road was empty, with no sign of the man in white. Nothing but trees on either side, their branches thrashing in the wind. I walked around the front of the car. The headlights cast long shadows across the fluttered ground. The bumper was destroyed, the hood crumpled from the impact. But it could have been worse. I was lucky I had not been going faster. Even so, the car was stuck with half its body in the ditch. The wheels spun uselessly in the mud with no traction. I pulled out my phone to call for help. And of course there was no signal. Not there in the middle of nowhere and in the middle of a storm. I cursed under my breath and put the phone away. Had I really seen him? Or was I losing my mind? The rain was still pouring, the wind still howling, but I barely noticed it. I was too stunned to think about anything else. I only knew I had to get out of there, to get away from whatever it was that had appeared in my path. I stumbled back toward the car, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. I had to leave. I had to get home. And just as I grabbed it, I heard a sound nearby. Something moving through the trees coming closer. I turned around, my heart in my throat. It was not the man in white. It was my father. I was so shaken that I had not even noticed the headlights of his vehicle. "Dad," I shouted, relief washing over me all at once. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his body, but I did not care. He was there. I was not alone anymore. "Are you okay?" he shouted as he came closer. "What happened?" "I saw your car." "There was a man in the road," I cut in, stumbling over my words. "I ran into him. I crashed." "He was here, Dad. Right here." My father frowned, looking around. The trees, the road, the empty space where the man in white had been. "I don't see anyone," he said with careful calm. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I insisted, my voice shaking. "He was there. I swear." He held my gaze for a long second, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "All right," he said firmly. "Let's get you out of here. We'll figure out the rest later." He helped me into his truck and we finished the drive in silence. Outside, the storm still raged. Inside, the cab was another world. Warm, dry. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see the man in white on the roadside. He never appeared. Again, it was as if he had never been there at all. "It might have been a spirit," my father said after a while, in a low voice. "People around here tell stories about things that walk the road at night, especially during storms. Lost souls looking for something. Or someone." A shiver ran through me. I did not want to believe it. I did not want to think that what I had seen was not human. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. There was something otherworldly about that man in white, something that did not belong in this reality. I did not sleep at all that night. The next morning, the police called me. They had found my car still wedged where I had left it, and they wanted me to come by the station to answer a few questions. I went. The officer in charge showed me a photograph. The man in white, just as I had described him. Pale, gaunt, wearing old-fashioned clothes from another time. "Do you recognize this man?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Yes," I said, my throat dry. "That's him. He's the one I saw." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner and turned back to me. "We've been getting reports about him for years," he said gravely. "People see him on that road, almost always during storms. But no one has ever managed to find him, at least not alive." "What do you mean, not alive?" I asked, a chill creeping up my spine. The officer hesitated for a second and handed me a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline made my heart lurch. "Man found dead during storm, dressed in white, had been missing for days." I stood there staring at the clipping. The date was more than 50 years old. The man in the photograph was the same one I had seen on the road, the same one I had crashed because of, the same one who had looked at me with those dark, empty eyes. "We don't know what he wants," the officer added quietly, "but people say he's looking for something, or someone." I left the station in a daze, the clipping clenched in my hand. The storm had passed and the sky was a clear blue, but I could not shake the cold that had settled into me. I still drive that route sometimes, but never at night. Never during a storm. And every time I pass the spot where I crashed, I think about the man in white, about what he might be searching for, and I pray I never find out. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to leave a like and share the fear with your friends. Subscribe for more tales that will chill you to the bone, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. Do you have your own horror story? Leave it in the comments. We'd love to read it. Stay safe, and remember, the most terrifying things usually happen when you least expect them. See you in the next nightmare.